Hello, welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's program on Tibetan independence with Tsering Shakya and Robert Barnett, and moderated by Ian Masters. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the very generous support of Andy and Branya Galef. Our moderator is Ian Masters. He's going to introduce our guest speakers. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of the Daily Briefing every Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. and Background Briefing on Sundays at 11 a.m., all on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and all of you for coming tonight to hear about a country and a people many care about, few know about, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about, as Tibetans set themselves on fire, Chinese rule hardens, and China remains defiant to Western pressure. We'll begin tonight with Tibetan scholar Tsering Shakya, who will give us a broad overview of this remote landlocked country in which most people live on a plateau at 15,000 feet or higher. He will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by Robbie Barnett, and then we'll have a discussion before extensive Q&A with you, our audience. I'm sure many of you have seen bumper stickers saying, "Save Tibet." And while it is clear that the drivers of these cars are not saving Tibet, it is not entirely clear what saving Tibet means. Are we saving Tibet from the Chinese? And if so, why do they need saving? Why can't they save themselves? And why has the Dalai Lama been unable to save Tibet in spite of enormous global sympathy and support? Perhaps saving a place in the first place is a problem. There is a certain evangelical ring to it, as though the country had fallen from grace and has to be redeemed by missionaries who will show them the light. This, of course, is deeply ironic, since many in the West assume Tibetans are born seeing the light, and that enlightenment is a national characteristic, a birthright, an innate talent, like surfing is for Hawaiians or yodeling is for the Swiss. It's also worth pointing out that we in the West have an appalling record of saving people, whether it is the Jews in World War II, the Cambodians in the 1970s, and more recently Sudanese in Darfur, and lately Congolese in the Congo, where 8 million have died. While today we wring our hands over Syria, after our intervention to rescue Afghanistan and save Iraq, where we saved hundreds of thousands of Iraqis by killing them, destroying their countries, then left it in chaos and on the brink of civil war, which is pretty much where we are in saving Afghanistan, where the leaders we install will soon fly off to the Gulf to join their stashes of millions in US taxpayer money they have pilfered, leaving their ravaged country to resume civil war. There is also a patronizing quality to the compassionate free ride of caring about something that you can do nothing about. And that is implied in the inference that Tibetans are perennial victims, in need of unyielding sympathy, even though we don't really know how many Tibetans want to be saved and from what. This is not to whitewash the Chinese, who, according to a lot of alarmist prognostications from writers of bestsellers about the Chinese miracle and the awakening dragon, are about to spread their wings, breathe fire, and take over the world. True, they have the world's second biggest economy, and it's growing fast. True, their military strength is growing, but not to the extent that the neocons, Jurassic Coal warriors, and shills for the military-industrial complex would have us believe. Furthermore, diplomats and scholars of China tell me that China's leaders don't see their own power the way the West imagines it. They are more preoccupied looking over their shoulders at their own restive population, who are outraged by the monumental and systemic corruption in the ruling Communist Party, a mafia in which the top officials and their princelings have a collective wealth of over $100 billion, with about 120 billion more stashed overseas, where the so-called naked officials send their children to be educated and sit on their golden nest eggs. Perhaps a more enlightened approach to Tibet will eventually come from a more enlightened and less corrupt Chinese government. There is an historical pattern of political reform and resistance that swells up and then is brutally struck down. The Red Guards were a reform movement of sorts before they went mad. The Tiananmen Square protests began as a reform movement against corruption, galvanized by the death of the purged reform leader Hu Yaobang. And recently, as the exploding internet used by the burgeoning middle class pushes the envelope, Chinese netizens are taking to the web, posting videos of the $10,000 Rolexes on the wrists of minor bureaucrats and party officials cutting ribbons on new roads, factories, malls, and hotels. Clearly, the leadership is haunted by the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, and just how much longer China's leaders can ride the tiger of perestroika while suppressing glasnost remains to be seen. And while I do not look forward to living under the yoke of Chinese colonialism in a world dominated by a new hegemon, could it be worse than what the Chinese lived under when the Western colonists plundered their country? Perhaps China is doing something right in Tibet, and I look forward to learning more. And since the Dalai Lama, who is lovable and almost beatified in the West to an unrealistic degree, is very mortal, has he failed as a leader? Is Tibet a prison? Are Tibetans living in a police state? And are all Tibetans opposed to Chinese rule? Are the Chinese developing and modernizing Tibet for Chinese immigrants? And are Tibetans facing cultural genocide, as many in the West and the Dalai Lama has charged? And finally, do all Tibetans support immolations, setting oneself on fire, which the Dalai Lama has not called upon Tibetans to stop? Tsering Shakya is the Canada Research Chair in Religion and Contemporary Society in Asia at the Institute for Asian Research at the University of British Columbia. Born in Lhasa, he fled to India with his family after the Chinese invasion. Then he won a scholarship to study in Britain and was later to graduate from London University School of Oriental and African Studies. Today, Tsering is a world-renowned and widely published scholar on both historic and contemporary Tibet. His most expansive work to date, The Dragon in the Land of Snows, A History of Modern Tibet since 1947, was acclaimed as a definitive history of modern Tibet by the New York Times. As an independent consultant and widely respected analyst, Tsering has addressed the European Parliament and is regularly invited to advise Western governments on Tibet-China policy. Tsering Shakya's published work include Fire Under the Snow, The Testimony of a Tibetan Prisoner, and he's also co-editor of the first anthology of modern Tibetan short stories and poems, Song of the Snow Line, New Writings from Tibet. He is currently engaged in a major research project on how contemporary literature is used as a voice of resistance in present-day Tibet. Ladies and gentlemen, Tsering Shakya.
These days, I dread sort of hearing news of Tibet, because every day, as I hear news of Tibet, it's always one of great sadness and of self-immolation that's happening. Since last 2 years, there has been over 113 people who have committed self-immolation in Tibet. And this is a new trend of form of protest that is developing in Tibet. And if we examine the China's sort of claims over Tibet, one of the strongest claims Chinese make about Tibet is the China, what I call the civilizing mission of China in Tibet, that China had provided development and social improvement and emancipation of the poor Tibetan serfs. But if we examine the true condition of the Tibetans today, it speaks very different of the situation. So when we talk about Tibet, there's what Tibetans talk about Tibet and what the Chinese talk about Tibet, the state talks about Tibet, it's very different. The Tibet, when China refers to Tibet, it often only refers to the autonomous region of Tibet, which the Tibetan considers as only one part of the Tibetan area. Tibetans tend to talk about all the areas of China where Tibetan population is spread. Traditionally, Tibetans define that there are three territories, the traditional three territories of Tibet as Central Tibet, Uyghur, Amdo, which is in Qinghai, and Kham, which is in Sichuan. And if you look at today, the Tibetan population is in China are divided into 5 provinces: autonomous region, Qinghai, Sichuan, Gansu, and Yunnan. That's where the Tibetan populations are distributed. And each of these provinces have slightly different policies towards the Tibetan context. If you look at, say, the autonomous region of Tibet, this is the most where policies are more strict. It's difficult for foreigners or even Tibetans living abroad to enter. There's a great deal of surveillance and control in that region because that has been traditionally until lately, it has been center of the sort of protests. Almost, if you look, say, from 1980s to 1995, most of the protests happened in Lhasa. What is so unique now of the protests that's happening is that the protests in Tibet have shifted from the central Tibet to the frontier regions, the frontier, the ethnic frontier between where the Tibetans and Chinese sort of coexist. That's in Amdo, Qinghai, and Sichuan area. That is where most of the protests are happening. And if you look at the self-immolations, the regions where self-immolation is taking place, it is also in the Amdo and Kham in Sichuan. It's a particular sort of that corridor. Just look at this corridor where most of the self-immolations are taking place. Now, why is the sort of the self-immolation taking place in this frontier? I tend to see that one of the important sense that Tibetans have is their sense of unique territory. Because Tibet has constituted a unique sort of territory. They have sense of great deal of sort of historical claims of homogeneous sort of territorial unit as Tibet. Secondly, they have this, until very recently, Tibetans have lived in a very sort of homogeneous community. Of course, in the frontier region, there has always been sort of interactions with Chinese groups and ethnic, but it's only very recently that there has been really sort of inroads of Chinese settlers and state intrusion, large level of sort of industrial development that's taking place in this region. And one of the things the recent development has propelled in the Tibetan mind is there's a great sense that the Tibetan culture, Tibetan uniqueness of its territory, its cultural heritage is on the verge of collapse. It's being verge of being destroyed. There's this great sense of danger for its civilizational preservation that is that existed much more than before. Of course, if you look at, say, people would say, well, during the Cultural Revolution, Tibetan language was banned, religion was banned. It's worse than present-day situation. Why is that? Why wasn't there self-immolation during the Cultural Revolution? And why is it happening now when in some ways there's much more lenient policy than compared to the Cultural Revolution? And why is this happening? But Cultural Revolution was a very unique period in Tibet and in China, in that sense that everyone was pretending their false compliance and false feigning compliance. They all said, we all are atheists, we don't believe in religion. Everyone knew, everyone was feigning their compliance. It was a false sort of community they lived in. But today, there's no sense of that false. You don't really know what is exactly happening in that. You know, you don't know, even the Chinese themselves in the Cultural Revolution did not believe what they were saying. And so today, this is a very different kind of changes that taking place. Secondly, there's an increasing influx of migration of Chinese into this territory. And there's, again, it's a very different from past sort of migration pattern. In 1960s to before 1980s, it's mainly, I would say, most of the Chinese who went to the Tibetan territories didn't want to be there. They were sent there as a punishment for military duties or for official duties. It wasn't really sort of settled. But today, new kind of settlers are coming. They are what I call real sort of immigrants, migrants coming, who are saying that my life will be better, my future will be better if it go to this area. I can make my living and make a living better for my family if I move into this territory. And there's this sense of permanence in migration pattern that is emerging. in this situation, there's a Tibetans feeling there's a great sense of disadvantage in that, and they are disadvantaged, and the new migrants communities are privileged by the state. If you look at this sort of population figure of Tibet, and again, everything about statistics about Tibet is disputed. You know, it's very hard to say the Tibetans in diaspora, the exile claim there are 6 million Tibetans, but if you look at the Chinese sort of census figures, it only gives about 4 million Tibetans. So this is general figure. But what more interesting is I want to look at is this urban-rural distribution of Tibetans. You have in autonomous region, almost 80% of the Tibetans live in rural community. They're mostly farmers or herding communities. And in different areas, Qinghai, that's the Amdo area, where 67% of the Tibetans live in rural area. That is to say, Tibetans are predominantly dependent on agriculture, that is farming and herding, and mainly rural communities. Again, if you look at the educational achievements of Tibetans today, in the autonomous region, 46% don't have any schooling. So if you compare the rest of China, which is 7.7% with no schooling, in the autonomous region, you have absolute almost a preference with any kind of situation. And look at secondary education. Only 12% of the population have any kind of secondary education. In that, so there's great disparity in the development between what's happening in the rest of China and the Tibetan region. And these are the sort of 5 different provinces in that. And I just put Shanxi because this is a sort of Chinese province where only 8.1% have no schooling. But in all the Tibetan areas, that figure is extremely high with any kind of education. What I want to show that is the education level and the rural community reflects the actual sort of disparity of development that existed. However, I'm not just saying that the current protests and that's happening is a result of disparity of economic development. What really, there is a great deal of sense of a crisis in Tibetan community that's happening in Tibet. That is being disadvantaged and deprived, and there's a great sense of enrage in the destruction of their environment and their culture. That is a process that's happening out of Chinese development programs. One of the major development programs that the Chinese government have constituted in particular areas where the assimilation taking place is the resettlement of nomads and herding community, that they are being moved into permanent settlements. And these projects, initially for first 2 or 3 years, they're quite successful because government pumps a lot of subsidies and support. But after that, these people don't have jobs and industry resources, and they become very much sort of like isolated and deprived of any kind of resources or skills to compete with the rest of the community. And that is causing sort of really great deprivation of economic deprivation and also sense of cultural sort of loss among the Tibetans. Now, if you look at 2008, there was a major protest in all of the areas of Tibet. If you look at the map of where the protests happened, what is so interesting, it's almost happened in almost every Tibetan area that was populated by Tibetans. And this is sort of almost a national. Doesn't seem to mean that these protests were happening in isolated places. It's a national. It's almost every Tibetans were engaged in this protest. And one of the results of the protest was that hundreds of people were arrested and imprisoned. And not only that individuals were imprisoned, but families were imprisoned and punished as a result of the 2008. Now, what is interesting? Why are the people are adopting self-immolation as a protest? Self-immolation is really sort of quite strong will, a demonstration of their rage, and also deprive the authority of the power to punish. If you protest and put write a poster or make slogans, you could be sent to prison for 8 to 12 years, and you could be tortured. But when you protest and burning yourself, who do you punish? After death, it deprives the government of person to punish. There is no possibility of punishing that person. So that's why government is now instituting various means of seeking way to punish those people. There is now legislation has been passed for assisting people for the self-immolation of members of families are now being detained. But what's the most strongest is that Tibetans are saying it's a total rejection of the Chinese state. Other aspect, what many commentators argue about that, well, demonstrations happen all over China. What's the difference between demonstrations that's happening in different parts of China and the Tibetan demonstration? The demonstrations in China tend to be about very specific grievances. It's about land acquisition, it's about compensation, it's right to schooling, road building, so certain sort of specific incidents. Whereas in Tibet, the protests happened about total rejection of the Chinese state and the Communist Party. It's not about one specific issue. It is about total rejection of the Chinese. They do not recognize the Chinese state, what the protesters are saying. They are not asking for evaluation of particular grievances or issues, but they are asked rejecting entire Chinese state. And that is something very different from what the protest that is happening. And there is no sort of sign or indication these protests will stop. In fact, once this protest has happened, it has become imitated and has become, these protesters are being valorized as heroes and martyrs, and it is becoming sort of copied and imitated. And I think this will continue. And this also presents a particular problem for the Chinese government. They don't know how to deal with it. How do you sort of protest and deal with this form of protest when you cannot detain a person who had committed to burn himself? You cannot imprison him. You cannot punish him. He's no longer there. So this presents a particular difficulty. But however, I think Chinese government are taking notes, and ways of policy will change towards Tibetan areas. But at the same time, the government will not want to be seen as having been pressured into making these changes. What the Communist parties want to do is that the change will happen because of the kindness and benevolence of the party, not because out of pressure of the protesters. And what are the key grievances that Tibetan protesters have made in most of the testimonies they left is about issues of Dalai Lama's return and language rights, and also freedom of religion. Another interesting aspect of self-immolation, almost all those who have protested is either monks or nuns, majority are monks or nuns, or associated with some religious group. They tend to be a religious community. And one of the things Chinese government claim that why the religious community, the monks and nuns are involved in protests is they're saying that the religion is interfering in state affairs and administration. But in fact, I would say one of the reasons why the religion groups are most active in these protests, in the forefront of these protests, is essentially they are not really wishing to interfere in state policy, but actually they are resisting state interference in religion. Rather than, so they are trying to interfere in public policy, but they are resisting state interference and incursion into purely religious affair. So they're asking, what does it matter to the Communist Party or the Chinese state who elects the abbot of the monastery? Monastery should be entirely autonomous institution where they should be allowed to elect the abbot, or what are the courses or curriculum that are developed in monasteries should be monastic affair, not of the state business. So the resistance is not about they wishing to interfere in the state affair, it's essentially about resisting state interference in religion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tsering. Robert Barnett is the director of the Modern Tibetan Studies program, professor of contemporary Tibetan studies, and associate research scholar in modern Tibetan history at Columbia University. Professor Barnett founded and directs the Modern Tibetan Studies program at Columbia, the first Western teaching program in its field. His most recent books are Tibetan Modernities, Notes from the Field, and Lhasa, Streets with Memories. From 2000 to 2006, he ran an annual summer program for foreign students at Tibet University in Lhasa and taught there. He runs a number of educational projects in Tibet, including training programs in ecotourism and conservation. Before joining Columbia in 1998, Professor Barnett worked as a researcher and journalist based in the United Kingdom, specializing in Tibetan issues for the BBC, the South China Morning Post, Voice of America, and other media outlets. Ladies and gentlemen, Robbie Barnett.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor this evening at the Hammer Forum. I want to talk to you about the same issues that Tsering Shakya has raised and that Ian raised in his introduction, but from a different point of view. How do these issues, how do these facts look from the point of view of China? I'm going to say sometimes the Chinese, an imaginary average Chinese person, doesn't exist. But I think this is the important issue here. When Ian asks, why can't this issue be saved? I don't think, as you said, we should think of saving, but we can think of solving. We can think of solutions. And the reason why that word becomes important is because actually this is not a difficult situation to resolve. The Tibetans have a leader who's exceptionally moderate, who's made major compromises on his demands, and who seems to have massive support from his followers. Therefore, on paper, a negotiation is possible. So we have a serious question here. Why can't it be solved? And I'm going to suggest that that's because of a fundamental difference in perception by different sides in the story. There are many sides, not just Chinese and Tibetans or officials and lay people, but let's imagine that difference in perception is between, say, Chinese views and outsider views. And I want to look at the facts that Tsering just presented to you and try and imagine them, invite you to imagine them as they're framed by an average Chinese viewer or an average Chinese official. When we see a picture like this, here, this is a picture of Tibetans at a funeral of the first person in the current wave of immolations 2 years ago. Thousands of people sitting silently at a funeral. How does that look to an average Chinese official in China? Probably very strange, probably very odd. How does that look to them? The images we're used to of conflict in the streets of Lhasa 2 years ago, or of troops in an area where protests and immolations had begun in the last 2 years. Those are the images we're used to. But for Chinese people, I think these are seen as a response to violence. They understand those incidents to have been threats to the state, and the police response is legitimate. They are given images like this, or like this, Tibetan violence against Tibetans, endlessly repeated on television. So there's a certain logic to that perception, a logic we have to deal with and understand. There's another logic, perhaps, that we can imagine for many people in China, many officials, which is that Tibetans are a very small part of the population in a very remote area. Remote here being a metaphor for distant from the capital. That population, about 0.4% of China's population, minute, and yet taking up a major part of its international affairs and getting a lot of its budget as well. And as you heard from Tsering's presentation, most of that population is in the countryside. Now only about 50% of Chinese people are in the countryside. So that would equate with not just small, but backward. And that area, if we look at it on a map of Eurasia, we can start to see some problems with that view. We can see that actually the Tibetan areas are about 1/4 of China's landmass, a tiny population in a very large space. That helps us see immediately why the Chinese react so sensitively to any issues there. If we add the other disputed areas with ancient national histories, Xinjiang and Mongolia, to the Tibetan case, we can see they're about 2/3 of China's territory. That's a very significant area of land. And we can look at this historically. People don't talk about this a lot, but it may be in the back of people's memories, that these are the areas, Tibet and so on, which are the grinding points, the points of contact between great empires of Eurasia and South Asia. In this last century, the Soviets, the Indians, and the PRC, that conflict with the British when they invaded Tibet, these are the points of conflict between those great powers. And when the PRC expanded in 1950 to include Tibet in a formal way, we see conflicts all along its borders with those other powerful neighbors. The war with India, especially in 1962, you can see Vietnam and other border wars with Russia and so on. There are large historical driving forces behind these issues. Another way of looking at this, now a way that is never really seen even by experts, let alone by Chinese officials, the cultural zone of peoples in the world who traditionally look to Lhasa as their spiritual or cultural home. We can see that's not just Tibetans here on the Tibetan plateau, not just Mongols, but Buryats, Tuvas, people in Siberia, Tibetans in Ladakh in northwestern India, northern Nepal, Bhutan, and even parts of Burma, an area of about 75 million people, and Kalmykia, that enclave of Tibetan Buddhist Mongolians within Russia. Actually, a large cultural community, as Tsering put it, a civilization, we could say. And we can see another reason why Tibet is deceptively important in ways that aren't always acknowledged. In terms of water supplies, the highland of the Tibetan plateau nourishes about 1/5 of the world's populations through these major rivers that feed Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, India, and indeed China as well. And about 95% of China's water supply comes from the Tibetan plateau. So there are many reasons why Tibet is much more important than it would seem. Here's a military reason. Since 1998, it's the only nuclear trijunction in the world, 3 nuclear powers facing each other across the Xinjiang and Tibetan zones. So this helps address that question that Shakya raised. Why do they react so differently in China to a handful of protests in Tibet and not in the same way to something like 1,000 such protests in China, 1,000 times the number of protests in mainland China? So let's go back again to that imaginary framework of a Chinese perception, a fundamental Chinese perception of Tibet, a fundamental reason why it's so hard for them to hear complaints from the West or complaints from exiles or protests within Tibet, is that they perceive Tibetans as very wealthy because China has boosted the economy remarkably. An average Tibetan official gets far greater wages than an average Chinese official. Of course, there may be other ways of making money than wages, but it's still significant. You can see here that a Tibetan official in Tibet, whether they're Tibetan or Chinese, they get more than any other officials in any other province-level area in China, except Beijing and Shanghai on average. You get a lot of money for working there. This produces a very wealthy urban middle class in Tibet. You can see a massive increase in businesses as China relaxed its economic rules in the early 1990s. You can see increase now in communications, the number of Tibetans on the internet. It may not be true, the claims. This picture here, you can see anybody who's lived in Tibet will know that this is a faked picture because nobody wears these clothes except for a wedding. But still, people are able to use modern communications, modern travel, modern infrastructure, and so on. We can see that in the figures for the number of color televisions, actually per household in Tibetan towns, more than in the average in China. The same with cameras. Pretty similar, not far behind, with phones. This is a wired community, at least in Tibetan towns. massive injection of money to produce wealth in Tibetan towns. This wealth is not naturally produced. You can see from this chart, it comes from subsidies. It comes from government forcing a very rapid marketization of the economy and building infrastructure on an unimaginable scale. But it still makes a wealthy Tibetan middle class. And that's what Chinese people see when they go to Tibet. And it's not just a casual visit to imagine Chinese going to Tibet. China has pegged the Tibetan's economy to tourism in the last 15 years, so that there are now 10 million tourist arrivals a year in the Tibet Autonomous Region. That's 3 times the population. And 95% of those 10 million are Chinese domestic tourists. In fact, there's a whole love affair among the middle class in China, particularly the wealthier middle class, with Tibet. Much like Westerners in some ways 20, 30 years ago, Tibet's seen as an exotic, mysterious place with beautiful landscape and exquisite architecture. So we have a very complicated situation there where many Chinese go there, many Chinese like it, and many people say, but it's very wealthy, it's very happy. I took a Chinese student once with me to Lhasa. She'd been studying in America. We went to Lhasa University. She left after 24 hours saying, I've seen all the roads that my people have built for these Tibetans, and everything you told me, you Westerners in general, told me about what we have done in Tibet was a lie. She left because of seeing just that infrastructural development. I'm very profoundly interested in that because you can see in these pictures what she saw, the modern city, the skyscrapers, the shops, and so on. I'm profoundly interested in that because I think it represents a difference between the seen and the unseen. She responded to the seen, what she could see in front of her. But I think what Tibetans are responding to is the unseen, the costs that can't really be caught very easily by photographers, by tourists, by visitors, or perhaps even by officials. I'll try and give an example of this. This is an example of something you can only see if you have a memory going back several decades. The Potala Palace was a mile outside the city of Lhasa in the 1930s. It's now there in the middle of the city, and there's the old city, just a quarter of a massive conurbation. And this is a photo I took nearly 15 years ago. It will be much bigger now. That skyscraper, the highest one in the center of Lhasa, is actually the police station. You'd have to know that to realize what it's doing. And the wealth that you get in the urban areas is not necessarily equivalent to the wealth in the rural areas, as you heard. China is quickly trying to change that. And when you talk about migration, what's interesting about the migration of Chinese to Tibet is they are all in the urban areas. Tiny number overall, but heavily concentrated among working age males. They are not mainly Tibetan, if we're talking about the urban area here of Lhasa. So we can see a whole set of costs for this kind of growth, which are not probably visible to the casual observer. Here we can see the cost in language. Every sign almost we can see in this photo is in Chinese, although there is a law in Tibet and in China for all autonomous areas which says you must have signs in both languages, but you can hardly see the Tibetan. There it is, just small, insignificant. That really is a map of Tibetan language use in Tibet, of Chinese language use, its dominance in Tibetan areas today. Religion is a bit similar. You can see plenty of religion in Tibet. You see it everywhere. I talked to these people. They prostrated for about 800 miles over 6 months and were within about 100 yards of their goal in the center of Lhasa when I talked to them. You can see many people every day in the main temple in Lhasa. But you can't necessarily see who isn't there. You can't see why this girl is wearing a mask, ostensibly to protect her from dust, but actually because she's an official, a minor official working in some office. She's not allowed to practice religion. Rules were brought in 1994 saying that government officials in the TAR, if they're Tibetan and if they're Buddhist, are not allowed religious practice. Students, the same. My students at the university, not allowed to go to a temple or a monastery. These are rules that are not only not visible, you'd have to know these people to know that, they're not written down anywhere. These are rules passed by word of mouth from party secretaries to units in the schools or offices. We did see this written down, the ban on pictures of the Dalai Lama, but it only said they couldn't be displayed in monasteries. But the practice is you can't have them in the TR, and you can't also worship the Dalai Lama, something that isn't written down. What's written is much less than what's done. You could get a sense of it from this banner outside my window when I first arrived at the university in the years when I was allowed there, from 2000. You can see there the name of the Dalai is written in black. It's very rude to say Dalai. It's spelt wrong in Tibetan, actually. And it says the Dalai is the source of all conflict or all turmoil in Tibetan society. So these are the kind of things that Tibetans had to learn. Another unseen sign, which we have to have interpreted for us, a poster of the Potala with the Bodhisattva Chenrezig rising above it, in a photocopy shop in Lhasa. There was no one else in the shop when I went in, and the owner said to me, this image is the Dalai Lama. It stands for the Dalai Lama, although they can't show him. So there's a whole hidden world of meaning there. And finally, I want to mention something that we don't really know about much because it's just being discovered now. I've been researching it. What's happening in Tibet today? What's happening is a whole new structure of government is being introduced. Here we see outside in the front of the Potala, we see implements that are now placed there to stop somebody from burning if they immolate themselves. But what I'm interested in is here, this on the side, the new set of police stations built on street corners, 630 built last year, a whole new set of police stations at the street corner level. And here we can see a banner in front of the Potala exhorting people to be patriotic. This is normal in China, or it was normal in China 20, 30 years ago, but it's still current in Tibet. They're a checkpoint that people have to go through in order to enter the Potala Square to circumambulate. And there, these are not people going into a subway to get into the Potala Square. The Potala's just on the left. Down there, you can just see another checkpoint they have to go through. Checkpoints within your city. And here, the first sign we discovered of a whole new system of government, offices in each area of the city of Lhasa, with new officials in charge of each 20 blocks or 20 compounds of houses. A whole new structure of government at a lower level than we've ever seen before. A little monastery, you can see a photo here of the monastery, but if we close up into this stand in the middle of the courtyard, we can see what happens in every monastery in the Tibetan Autonomous Region and many others. It's an education system. Self-criticism notes have been put up by the monks requiring themselves to show their love for the nation and to advocate harmony. It means criticizing the Dalai Lama. And here, a particularly telling image that came to me just a couple of months ago. These buildings here at the back of the Ganden Monastery, probably 100 monks left in that monastery now, used to be several thousand. These are massive buildings put up for officials to live inside the monastery. Now every monastery in the TAR has to have a group of cadres running the monastery. So when Tsering talks about the intrusion of religion, the intrusion of the state into religious and cultural life, you can see it here in concrete form. And this, just to remind you, to end on the note that Tsering Shakya mentioned, what did the Tibetans say when they immolate? This is the most senior of the Tibetans who's immolated so far, a Lama who died in January last year, just to repeat what you heard. The words that he used in the final document he sent out, a reference to the Dalai Lama as the cultural leader who can solve these problems, a reference to a Tibetan nation, could mean nationality, doesn't necessarily mean a political nation, we don't know. But here the details are about culture, the unseen costs of this kind of change. This may be here. What we can imagine is in the minds of these people at that funeral, and these may be the issues that for Chinese officials are invisible and that can't be seen. And if we want to see a solution, we're going to have to make the conversations between the two sides somehow aware of these invisible issues. Thank you.
So, Robbie, you've set up a picture here of people talking past each other, and I noticed that when the Chinese were putting on their big display for the Beijing Olympics, when the torch was coming around, every time there was Tibetan demonstrations throughout Europe and all the way through the United States, there was tremendous backlash from the Chinese. And here in Los Angeles, a lot of the Chinese students were furious. So I understand that side of it. But of course they don't know what it's like to be Tibetan and what Tsering has told us. So where do you think this dialogue could ever begin, assuming it could begin? Where would it begin?
Well, I think
Pull the mic in closer, yeah.
I think we can actually be practical, at least in answer to that question to some extent. These issues are very difficult. Fundamentally, they're issues about political will. Do the Chinese and the Tibetans really want to resolve this issue, or both sides, their leaders and so on? But assuming they do, there is a practical step that they could take, which is pretty straightforward. They could divide the issues from the long-term issues as opposed to the short-term issues. The long-term issues in this dispute are over whether Tibet is independent, what its status should be in China today, what form of autonomy it should have, and what role the Dalai Lama should have. These are very difficult historical questions for China to deal with. But many of the issues the two of us have raised today, as you can see, are actually not related to that directly. They're related to policies that have been brought in the last 20 years, particularly this policy of attacking the Dalai Lama, these policies of not allowing Tibetans to discuss issues of migration, issues of language change, and so on. Those issues they should deal with separately, and those issues they should treat as things that are very short term that could be solved very quickly.
And Tsering, do you see any possibility of compromise? Pull the mic right close.
If you look at the Chinese constitution,
pull it like this.
Oh yeah. If you look at the read Chinese constitution, in the Tibetan regions, for example, as Robbie mentioned, all the signs, the first language of administration and language of the government and public science should be in Tibetan, and these are guaranteed in constitutions. It is so some way actually the Chinese government just implement their own laws.
Even on their own people, too.
People, yes, to redress some of the grievances public anger of Tibetans have. It's not seeing the Tibetan language being used in that. In fact, today most of the cadres and the officials working in Tibet don't speak Tibetan. They only use Chinese language. But this is technically, it's not constitutionally right. Autonomous region, the primary language should be Tibetan. So in some sense, the Chinese government simply can actually implement its own laws to redress some problems. But there is certain extent level of arrogance and level of indifference in Chinese government attitude, because that's in their perception, Tibetan situation, the population in terms of number of people involved is tiny. Their ability to affect the Chinese larger politics is minimum. So there's a totally sort of indifference towards what's happening.
Is there racism involved in it?
There is a tremendous prejudice towards Tibetan. This is, in fact, Tibetans are often or constantly referred to as the backwards people. Here the Chinese are not coy or shy about saying, the officials were saying, these are backward people. We are trying to help them. We are trying to. It's almost like 18th, 19th century Europeans coming to North America and saying these people are backward and we are bringing civilization. And this is very much the heart of the Chinese, and they constantly talk about we are bringing civilization and development. So that is, in a sense, it's another sort of problem. The Chinese don't see the resentment the Tibetans have, or the complaints or the protests that the international community express about them.
And Robbie, how much has this railroad exacerbated the problems? At the same time, the one thing, I mean, in an otherwise pretty grim appraisal here,
the one thing that I got from what you said that was vaguely hopeful was that middle-class Chinese tourists go to Tibet and are ultimately fairly sympathetic. So they're coming up via that railroad, right?
Well, we sometimes think of these things too simplistically. I think the message is that it's really complex. It's not that either side is wrong, but the Chinese are right that there's a lot more wealth and a lot more communications infrastructure and airports and trains and so on. So they're right about that. It's just that this doesn't tell us the whole story. And similarly, Tibetans are right as well. And with the railway, I think it has brought a huge number of Chinese tourists to Tibet. We don't know yet whether that's going to be a help in a solution, whether those tourists are going to end up thinking in a political way about Tibet. I think we have to remember that when our forefathers, maybe not yours, but mine, went to India in the 1880s with the modern technology that could get them there, then they also loved India. Many of them were far greater scholars of Indian languages than many Chinese are in Tibet. But it didn't necessarily change their political sense of ownership of India. So sometimes the love affair doesn't necessarily lead to a particular political change in opinion. But back to the railway, the railway is changing things quietly in quite a different way. It's making mining profitable. And this is and combined with new road building technology. And now we talked about tourism as being the basis of the economy, and we talked about subsidies driving it. By next year, mining profits will be driving the Tibetan economy. Tibetan society, for the first time, I think, will become profitable for Chinese. And that's going to be a really major challenge to Tibetans because of the pollution, the danger, the immigration that encourages of a wholly new kind. So there's a whole new chapter is opening up.
But there's no business sector amongst the Tibetans, right? The
No,
Chinese own everything, do they?
No, there's a huge business sector among Tibetans. It's just much smaller than the Chinese one. This is why it's so difficult to
who owns
talk about
these mines? Who owns these mines?
Well, mostly they're Chinese companies, or some of them are half Canadian companies, a couple of them, but mostly they're Chinese companies. But there's some Tibetan mines as well. But the Tibetan businesses follow behind the curve of Chinese businesses. So the Tibetans are a pretty small sector, but you get very wealthy Tibetans. But some of those wealthy Tibetans end up in prison because they're perceived as political threats to China, but they exist.
And Tsering, is there any, obviously we don't know where China's heading, but there's certainly a kind of quiet revolution going on amongst the middle class. The net is definitely creating its own kind of form of political activism and political energy. And, the party says they want to stamp out corruption publicly, and instead of 12-course dinners, now they're down to 5, the state banquets. But most people think that's insulting. But privately, I understand that the leadership basically is telling the cadres that not to give an inch. So you have two messages coming out of the elite, but they're clearly concerned. So do you foresee a day when you will have some kind of revolution in China that brings about a more democratic state, and therefore much of Tibet's problems would go away because you'd be dealing with more enlightened country? I mean, that's based on the assumption that the Chinese people, don't necessarily like the system they have, or even though it's been able to buy them off.
There's two aspects to the Tibetan issue and the question. One is the actually question about sovereignty and right for Tibetans for nationhood. This problem will not disappear whether China has become democratized or not, because this is a nationalistic aspiration of nationhood exists in many contexts. in Europe, you have a Basque nationalist or Northern Ireland situation. Scotland may be going independent very soon. They're having referendum in September. So there's this nationalistic aspiration, and it exists in many Asian countries. In India, it's democratic, liberal sort of system government, but you have Kashmir, which you want to separate. So similarly, if China were to sort of democratize, the Tibetan desire for independence will still continue to exist. And that is how democratic Chinese government responds to that is another matter. If China, if we compare to before 1980s and period of liberalization today, China has really dramatically changed, incredible changes in personal freedom and larger public spaces for people to engage in activities. And this is also happening in Tibet. To some extent, if you look at, say, Tibetan language websites and forums and blogs, incredible vibrancy there, people writing about it, you know. And sometimes when we look at it...
Is that keeping the language and culture alive in a sense? Is that...
Yes, I think one of the things very interesting is mobile phones, iPhones and the internet had a really huge impact on Tibetan language. The ease in which we can use Tibetan language in modern technology had really, today we can send text message in Tibetan, people writing blog. I mean, this is something so new for us, novel, and actually encouraging people. Before, when people said, well, Tibetans were useless, you cannot even do this. Now, because Tibetan language is fully integrated into modern technology, it is compatible with any other languages. One of the really wonderful things about modern technology is no language is disadvantaged. If you can incorporate this language in the modern technology, you can say it is not intrinsically some language cannot work with this kind of modern technology. But so this has encouraged incredible vibrance of Tibetan language today. So in some degree, yes, there is some degree of freedom, is a revival of Tibetan culture, particularly in language that's happening. But at the same time, when you look at the content of these writings, there's great sense of anger and resentment of what is happening. And there's great rage and fear that Tibetan, as a people, as civilization, is in the verge of collapse. That is sense of rage they have. Mm.
And Robert, do you have a take on the same question? Do you think that democratization of China will be the way out, in a way, of this, what seems to be a terrible impasse here?
You know, the flip side of this is that nationalism in China is not limited to the current nationalism under the Communist Party. Nationalism in China, if you had a democratic China, would be stronger, just as we see it in post-Soviet Russia. You know, nationalism could become very strong in China in a democratic system. And
well, didn't the Chinese, after Tiananmen, push nationalism as a way to hold back democracy?
Yes, I think they did. Maybe it was a way to satisfy people and to divert them from that particular demand. But nationalism will emerge anyway, and if you have a democratic system, you'll have much less control over it than the Communist Party has over it now, and it could be very negative for Tibetans. We just don't know how a democratic China would work out. I mean, I think, though, it does point us to a fundamental issue, which is not really that Tibetans are suffering so terribly. That's part of the story, but maybe only a smaller part of it. One of the real issues that I think is happening in Tibet is that Tibetans are not allowed to talk about it. They're not. You know, in China, in most of China, Chinese people can talk about bad economic policies and corruption and many issues. They can't talk about every issue, but they can talk. But in Tibet, since the early 90s, it's really not safe for Tibetans to raise even issues of economic policy, let alone sensitive issues like migration, the railway. They just can't talk about it. So,
but can they talk about underground? I mean, is there a schizophrenia here about something's got to be keeping
Well, this is
the protest movement alive.
This is the big difference between Lhasa, the central Tibetan areas, the TAR, and the eastern Tibetan areas. Eastern Tibetan areas were very relaxed in the 80s, 90s, and earlier part of the 2000s. And there people did talk about it. You would meet people, Tibetans, at home anyway, and they would openly discuss these things. But in the TAR, the intimidation effect was really total. Nobody would really say what they thought. It was like we imagined the old Soviet state. And this is hugely significant because you had protests in Tibet where expression of views would erupt in the streets every few years and so on. But in eastern Tibet, people could talk about it, and yet the protests in 2008 have moved to the east. So China has lost the eastern Tibetans. They were relatively compliant for the 80s and 90s, and now they've been lost. So this is a huge blow for Chinese policy.
But again, something has to be keeping the rage alive and the political movement alive, even if you can't talk about it. I mean, there's got to be.
Well, you get these eruptions of protest.
Right.
The protests are not talking.
Right.
The protests are doing, and that's what happens. And they are starting to get gradually to show signs of violence. Not very much. There's been very little violence over the last 30 years among Tibetans, but it is increasing in some of these incidents.
Well, I'm trying to get a handle on how you'd have a collective consciousness yet such repression. You know.
Well,
maybe Tsering has a thought. Sorry.
Maybe Tsering has a thought.
I think this is the issue. So how does we talk about how does Chinese nationalism emerge? Say it's the Japanese and the Western colonialism or the imperialism created Chinese nationalism. So what is Tibetan nationalism or Tibetan response created by response to Chinese presence? Tibetan response on nationalism and identity and consciousness did not emerge out of Western imperialism. It's really essentially out of Chinese imperialism. So the presence of Chinese in Tibetan lives is felt by everyone. And that is the sort of creating that sort of consciousness of being Tibetan. And the Tibetans, for example, this is many Chinese students who come over or from Chinese scholars who can say, they cannot understand why the Tibetans are protesting, complaining about freedom, religion, and issue. And they assume the policies of liberalism and a great degree of tolerance that enjoyed in the rest of China is same as in Tibetan area. But this is not the case. For example, so for Chinese now, it's really easy to get passport to travel abroad. Within 10 days, you can obtain a passport and you can travel abroad. You can, if you got money, you can send to your children to. But for Tibetans to travel abroad, it's virtually impossible to get a passport.
From the TAR,
yeah,
especially.
TAR and many other, unless you are government cadre and official to travel abroad, official duties. Otherwise, it's virtually for ordinary citizens to get passport. But for Chinese, this is that's cannot understand because it's within 10 days they can get passport to travel abroad. So the experience of Tibetan is very different. And for example, today what you can see, I mean, I didn't have it shown in slides, I could have shown is many notices for job announcements in Lhasa, which says only Chinese. And there are job announcements where you got wages for Chinese 50 yuan an hour, Tibetan 30 yuan an hour. It's the same job. That sort of thing is very common. There's no sort of sense of shame or feeling this is incorrect in China. It is a very ordinary, you see that sort of sign.
But I think that could change very quickly. Chinese views change very fast. You see that all over the Chinese world. They're very attentive to new ideas that come up on the internet or Weibo or something like this. Chinese views could change if the government allowed them to change. And also, Tibetans, one of the really interesting things about Tibetans inside Tibet is they're incredibly attentive to very, very small changes in policy, changes that you and I would think were nothing, were negligible. But slight moderation, slight relaxation of a policy by China does immediately lead to a softening of opinion among many Tibetans. So we say urban Tibetans and so on. For example, last year before last, in August, a new party secretary was appointed in Lhasa, and he did a smart thing. He went around meeting ordinary people, and he didn't wear pompous clothes, and he looked like an ordinary person, and a rumor was spread that his wife was a Buddhist. That probably helped. And then he gave jobs to university graduates. That's about 200 people who were Tibetans. And immediately, opinion towards him was rather positive. So we're really dealing with a situation which is nothing like Palestine, Darfur. We're not dealing with deeply embedded ethnic hatred. We're not dealing with violence that is leading to centuries of bitterness, although the Tibetans have experienced that in the 60s and 70s. We're dealing with people who are willing to accept changes in policy if they're reasonable changes. And that's why it's so serious that we're sitting here today discussing a solution, because there's no sign of a solution in a situation that easily could be solved.
Well, let's take questions here. We have microphones on both sides, and
Thanks. This is a question for Robbie. I was interested when you mentioned that there's this emerging wealthy middle class amongst the Tibetans. Is that causing any sort of rift amongst that culture where, because they're getting wealthy off the government and the subsidies, that they're sort of compliant or complicit with the government and want to see further development and are not so outspoken about the issues?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You know, I've tried to look at this issue. You know, we have a basic paradigm when we think about totalitarian, authoritarian states, and especially communist ones, of people are either collaborators or they're resistors, they're martyrs or collaborators. But that doesn't seem to be the way Tibetans usually view the situation. They seem to view people who work with the Chinese system as people who have to do what's necessary in order to survive. And they may even view them as very clever and very effective, very strategic. There doesn't seem to be an initial sense of resentment against them, especially if they get wealthy. That can be welcomed. That's seen as a good model. That does happen. The idea of the collaborator occurs quite rarely, I think, when a Tibetan says more than they are forced to say. So as you saw when I showed the slogan against the Dalai Lama, every Tibetan official was basically forced to repeat that slogan and 3 other similar slogans. And Tibetans who had to do that, everybody understood that they had no choice unless they were going to volunteer to go to prison. And nobody accused them of being collaborators unless they did it too soon, too fast, immediately, and too often. So you see a lot of officials make excuses. They say they're ill. So for a couple of days, they don't have to give that speech. Or they give the speech they read it in a very drab way that doesn't suggest much enthusiasm. So there's a very acute sense of interpretation about who is going too far to help the Chinese. But there's no big criticism of people who just survive in the system, let alone those who are wealthy.
You mentioned mining. What minerals are being mined in Tibet?
I think it's something like 120 that they've officially listed. And so it's really very significant as a resource base for China. The main ones that have always been prominent are chromite, I think it's called, that has been very productive for a long time. But now they're moving to copper and silver. So they have reserves of copper, about 6,000 tons in just this one mine that Tsering mentioned, where there's been a collapse outside Lhasa. And they also have very significant amounts of silver and gold. And this mine, unfortunately, is actually in the birthplace of the most famous Tibetan king from the 7th century. So they're digging up, basically, one of the really important heritage sites of Tibet. And the mine, this mine just collapsed. 83 people were killed in a landslide. I was going to show some images of it. We've discovered that the Chinese government said, and the mining company said, it was just a natural causes, just a geological disaster. But it's quite clear if you look at Google Earth. Now we've found the site of the landslide, that it was the debris from a mountaintop removal mine that was entirely illegal, not in the company's acknowledged plans, and not in the license area that had been given it to mine. And this was the debris that was thrown off the side of the mountain. It just slid down and submerged these people. So this was copper and silver and gold.
This is for Tsering. I guess I'll play the devil's advocate. I don't understand how you can possibly think you can accomplish anything. You've been Tibet, or Xinjiang, has been a part of China for probably over 1,300 years, and it's been an official province since, I think, the 1700s. And except for 5 years, when the Japanese attacked China, it's been Xinjiang. and they've been pouring Chinese in there for probably over 50 years. So, you know, it's nice to maintain your culture. That's possible. But to have an independence movement, impossible, unless you have something. That's my question. Where are you going?
And first, I don't know where you get the idea that Tibet has been part of China for 1,300 years. That's total sort of...
Some way, shape, or form.
No, not in any form of shape. Okay, either you are sort of totally mistaken or misinformed. For point that. Okay, we can discuss that much better. Any aspiration can be accused of being a delusion. No, you know, if you look at it, China's relationship with Korea, Vietnam, Mongolia, they were far more. Korea was considered the model client state of China. It's much more integrated than any Tibet was under China during Qing or during Yuan period that in Tibet. So it is why Tibet didn't become independent is totally different subject issue. But the aspiration of Tibetans as an independent country has always existed from the Tang period to present. You know, it is very different. And the Chinese government sees that as a very different than that. You look at which province in China did sign agreement with, for 17-point agreement with Tibet in 1950. After the communists came to power, there's not a single province in China where communists signed agreement. Tibet is the exception into that. You know, why would, if it was part of China all the time, why would they need to sign agreement? Do that. So there is a deep sense of that. Tibet constituted a unique position within present-day PRC in that. There's no, even only Hong Kong has that kind of relationship because of Hong Kong's economic status. And within China, I think there will be change and evolution process where that may be willing to relinquish and recognize the grievances and aspirations of the Tibetan people. You know, you can say that to Latvians and Estonians, with many of the countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which emerged out of collapse of Soviet Union. If you had, you know, no Sovietologist or Russian scholar would have ever accepted that Russia would collapse and that these new countries would emerge in our time. So we don't know what will happen. How my main interest will be say, how would the thinking, say, evolutions of Chinese community, you know, in North America, you know, today it's virtually universal. Nobody accepts racism as an acceptable form of practice, you know. But until 1950, it was a standard attitude in American culture to be racist. You know, if you're not racist, you're not American. But so how did it change? Why was it possible such a fundamental change could take place in America? That black person can be a president of America. So this kind of change will happen in some ways. You know, we cannot say force this kind of change. They are and how was it Britain was able to change, saying that empire was wrong? They need to relinquish their colonies. You know, why did it happen in that? And there are certain literary. I always say George Orwell's Shooting the Elephant in Burma was the point in where British realized the empire was wrong. You know, there's a certain point. And I think this process in China, in some ways, it's happening. If you look at the Chinese intellectual, look at the Wolf Totem, the book, novel. It's incredible indictment on China or the Han community by Han about what is done to Mongolians or minorities. There's a lot of intellectual discussion that is happening. At the present, China is going through a phase of triumphalism. You know, we emerged, we are triumphant now. There's a great deal of triumphalism in China in the sense of it's enjoying the success now of that. After this period, they will go through a period of reflection and they will start to think in terms of that. It's like China today, you know, they have no sort of sentimentality about destroying Tang Dynasty tomb. because they say development is better, progress is better. You look at the great sort of hutons and great sort of historical places in Beijing are demolished overnight without any kind of sentimentality, But because this is idea is progress is good, skyscrapers and glass building are good, all is bad, that kind of is sort of consensus attitude. But slowly this is changing. People are reflecting, regretting the sense of loss that China is experiencing. So similarly, in do with the ideas of colonization, ideas of relationship between people will also change, I think, in China.
I wanted to use your question in another way, which is, I think is actually crucial, your question, because it illustrates the Chinese, a typical Chinese official's question to Tibetans and the Dalai Lama is, why are you asking for independence? And then they might give the reason you gave. But actually, they're not asking for independence. The Dalai Lama has said he's giving that up. And I don't think, actually, we've discussed it here this evening, anybody saying we're asking for independence or pursuing it. Maybe people here are. So this is really, really interesting. How come statements, for example, languages being lost or cultures being degraded, are heard in China and elsewhere as requests for independence? We don't know that they are. We don't know that these people who are immolating are demanding independence. We do know in a few cases, but in many cases they haven't said that. They seem to be demanding the Dalai Lama return, their language be given more strength and so on. But it's heard in China as a demand for independence. That's one of the reasons the conversation can't happen. They can't hear people saying, no, I'm not here demanding independence, I'm demanding something else. So this is an important example of that.
Can I just add something important, I feel? Sometimes we think of China as a monolithic, uncompromising sort of state, But I find looking at China as really very flexible, very compromising in dealing with the international relationship or domestically. But this compromise and flexibility must not be seen as a weakness from the Chinese state. For example, there are ways to deal with the Tibet. Already the solutions exist within the Chinese framework and structure. How is China able to accept a two-system, one country in Hong Kong and Macau? Why is it that Hong Kong can have such a tolerance but still be part of China? There are incredible sort of autonomy that Shanghai enjoys to the other provinces. And there's a certain sort of level of flexibility China has that people don't. And there are mechanisms in China which can be equally dealt in relation to Tibet. So it's not something sort of unfathomable but for Chinese leadership or Chinese people about Tibet. And another thing is, when you look to say, if Tibet were to become independent, it will not make a slightest difference to Chinese economy. Okay. If you look at, say, 2008 protests that happened in Tibet, it was massive protests. It involved every single Tibetan village. It did not affect one bit in the drop in stock markets and prices in globally or in Shanghai or anything. It did not have an impact in that. So China will not collapse if Tibet was to become independent or something like that, So it's a Tibetan sort of territorially, it's constituted big size of China, but economic importance of China is very limited. Even say Tibet was independent, most of Tibet's resources has to go through China because of its landlocked situation. There isn't much option for that. So it is not inconceivable that Chinese government cannot be flexible and dealing with that. There are solutions already in the Chinese system if Chinese government. But the only problem about Tibet is for the party and Chinese authority, any solution or compromise reached must not be seen as out of demands or pressure from international community or out of the pressure. The solution must emerge as a benevolence of the party. And they will do so over take time, and they're presented as a benevolence of the party.
I think we'll have just one more question. The gentleman there.
Thank you. It isn't part of either the problem or the solution that the separation of the church and state, that in Tibet, the church and the state, it was a theocracy and run together, and for Han Chinese, it's a secular state. So is there some part of the solution where in Tibet you could separate the religious institutions so that the culture could continue, the religion could continue from the political apparatus of the state?
This historical sort of structure of Tibet is actually dead. It no longer exists. You know, Tibetans not asking for resurrection of what existed before 1950 or historical sort of tradition of Tibet. So that is not an issue of that. What is it matters actually? There is the idea of religion. What is the importance of religions in public life, in private lives of individuals? Is very different. For Tibetans, tend to be very religious in sense of actually they go to temples, they practice in the West. For larger Chinese community, religion is less of importance in daily life. But at the same time, this is changing in China. Actually, more people are becoming religious in China, and the number of Christian or the Buddhist community growing in China is enormous. And as I said, the problem about religion in Tibet and China is not about religion interfering in state affairs. It's about state affairing in religious institutions. And the problem of religion in China is about the Communist Party and religion. And one of the three things I say religion is a problem in China today under communism, as religion has three things which essentially looks like the Communist Party. It has leadership, it has a follower, it has an ideology. And a very often problem with religion is religious leaders are outside the country. And the problem with religion is not just with the Tibetan Buddhists, but the Catholics have the problem. Even Chinese Buddhists have a problem with that. So there's a problem with religion present day in China. It's nature of the Chinese state and the Communist Party. And in China, it's not the intellectuals or the dissidents who are form the main opposition to the government. It's the potential of the opposition comes from religious community because precisely they have the three things the Communist Party share and looks at it very similar to themselves. It's the leadership, structure, and the ideology. And that is a problem for Chinese Communist Party. It's not about Chinese state's problem or Chinese people's problem. It's the problem of the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you have a quick last word, Roy?
I think that here we touch on a big historical issue, which is the difficulty of communism and its successor ideologies in thinking culture and religion. I think it's been profoundly difficult for Marxists and their successors, whatever we call the Chinese thinkers now, to think about this kind of question. They come up with the formula you mentioned. You know, they say they oppose, like Americans, they say we don't want to have religion interfering with politics. But of course, that's not really the reality of what happens in America. They're intertwined all the time. And it's in England, of course, even more so. But I think for communists, and I think for modern states in general, it's very, very hard to really think religion and think culture and as politicians. I think that's true in many states. And it's interesting. It's one of the reasons why we sort of need people who study these questions in general, religion, culture, and so on, to try to talk to politicians and to explain to them, these are real issues. These are not just details on the side of your economic growth or your state building or your military adventures. You really need to think through what is the way in which a state is going to relate to these things. Hasn't been solved in America, hasn't been solved in most countries, and in China it's reached a conflict level.
Yeah, but we have, our state through the IRS have sanctified Scientology. At the same time, the Chinese went crazy over Falun Gong. So there are some major differences, aren't there?
Oh, there are certainly differences. I'm trying to be purely intellectual and talk about, on the scale of ideas, there are huge differences, of course. On the scale of ideas, no, there's a different difficulty in modernity with thinking about religion and culture. And when we look at states that run into conflicts, often this is what we're seeing. I mean, within that notion of culture, we can talk about this question of sometimes people call it ethnicity. Terrible word, actually, very modern, limited word. But nationality, that's a form of culture sometimes. History. What was this role of Tibetans, their relationship to the Chinese and the Chinese Empire in the past? These are questions that modern states are extraordinarily bad at really being able to talk about and think about. And Tibet is, and many other issues are very, very painful and tragic examples of that inability to really have those conversations.
Well, I thank both of you gentlemen for joining us here in Los Angeles. And